Picture a man standing on a hillside in southeastern Turkey, staring at limestone carvings so precise, so deliberate, so impossibly ancient that everything he had spent his life believing, everything the academic world had spent 2 centuries constructing, began to crack beneath his feet like the thin skin of ice over a frozen lake. The year is 1996. The man is Klaus Schmidt, a German archaeologist from the German Archaeological Institute. And the sight before him would not just change his career, it would shatter the most fundamental story humanity tells about itself, the story of how civilization began. Göbekli Tepe. The name translates roughly to Potbelly Hill in Turkish. It sounds almost comical for something so consequential. But what lies beneath that unassuming mound in the Anatolia region near the city of Şanlıurfa is nothing short of a monument to everything we do not understand about our own past. Massive T-shaped limestone pillars, some standing nearly 6 meters tall and weighing up to 10 metric tons, arranged in perfect circular enclosures covered in intricate carvings of animals. Foxes, scorpions, vultures, lions, and creatures that don't quite match anything alive today. Carbon dating places the oldest layers of this site at approximately 11,600 years old. That is not a typo, not a misprint. 11,600 years before the present moment, something or someone, was building structures of extraordinary complexity and symbolic power on this hillside. The problem? According to every textbook, every theory, as every carefully constructed model of human development, the people living 11,000 years ago were supposed to be simple hunter-gatherers, nomads, people who followed herds, slept in temporary shelters, and hadn't yet discovered agriculture, writing, organized religion, or monumental architecture. They weren't supposed to be capable of this. They weren't supposed to be doing this at all. And if you're ready to step into one of the most profound and unsettling mysteries in the history of human civilization, the mystery of who really built Göbekli Tepe, why Klaus Schmidt's discovery still makes certain academics deeply uncomfortable, and what this ancient hilltop site might be trying to tell us about where we really came from, you're in exactly the right place. Stay until the end, because the deeper you go into this story, the more the ground shifts beneath you. Klaus Schmidt was not a romantic. He was not a treasure hunter, not a showman, not the kind of archaeologist that movie directors build characters around. He was methodical, careful, technically rigorous, the kind of scholar who published dense papers in academic journals and spent decades earning the respect of institutions that don't give it easily. Born in Germany in 1953, he had spent years working at sites across the Middle East, developing an expertise in the Neolithic period, the era of human history that covers roughly 12,000 to 4,000 years ago, the span of time when humans supposedly made the slow, grinding transition from hunting and gathering to farming and settlement. Schmidt knew the standard model of Neolithic development better than almost anyone alive, which is exactly why what he found on that Turkish hillside in 1994 and began excavating seriously by 1996, struck him like a physical blow. Here's what makes his biography essential to this mystery. Schmidt wasn't the first person to notice Göbekli Tepe. An American archaeologist named Peter Benedict had surveyed the site back in 1963 and noted the flint tools scattered across the hill. But Benedict assumed the stone fragments were remnants of a Byzantine-era cemetery. Medieval, unremarkable, not worth a major excavation. The hill had been noted and dismissed, filed away. For 30 years, the most significant archaeological site on Earth sat largely ignored beneath its mound of soil, waiting. What if Benedict had looked closer? What if the academic assumptions of 1963 had been just slightly less rigid? An entire generation of scholars might have had to confront this evidence decades earlier. Instead, it waited for Schmidt, and some researchers have quietly asked, did it choose its moment? The actual excavation begins in 1996, and this is where the story accelerates into something that feels almost cinematic, almost impossible to hold in your hands as a historical fact. Picture the site in those early days, the dry, rocky hillside baking under the Turkish sun, the sound of trowels and brushes against ancient stone, the slow revelation of shapes that have no business being there. Schmidt's team begins uncovering the tops of the massive T-shaped pillars. Yet then almost immediately the scale of the problem becomes apparent. These are not primitive scratches on rock. These are not crude marks left by people who hadn't yet figured out how to chip flint properly. The carvings on these pillars, the reliefs of animals, the geometric patterns, the abstract symbols, display a level of artistic sophistication that archaeologists typically associate with civilizations thousands of years more advanced. And then Schmidt notices something that he will spend the rest of his life thinking about. The site wasn't just built, it was deliberately buried. Someone, some group, had intentionally filled in these enclosures with debris, covered the pillars, sealed the whole complex under tons of soil and rubble. Not by erosion, not by accident, on purpose. Now, this is not a civilization that collapsed and was forgotten. This is a civilization, or at least a site of enormous importance, that was consciously, carefully, methodically concealed. Could it be that whoever built Göbekli Tepe didn't want it found? Or, and here's where some researchers take a far more provocative position, could it be that the burial itself was part of the ritual? That the concealment was the final act of whatever ceremony this place was built to perform? What if the burial was a kind of cosmic closing, an ending of an age marked in stone and soil by people who understood something about cyclical time that we have completely lost? Let's talk about the pillars themselves. And because they are the heart of the mystery and the reason Klaus Schmidt spent the last 18 years of his life on this hillside. The site contains multiple enclosures. Archaeologists have identified at least 20 so far, though geophysical surveys suggest there may be 200 or more still buried across the entire area. Each enclosure consists of large T-shaped pillars arranged in a rough circle with two taller central pillars at the core. The T-shape is significant. It is not random. It is precisely repeated across multiple enclosures, across what appears to be centuries of construction. Some researchers believe the T-shapes represent stylized human figures, the horizontal bar a head or shoulders, the vertical shaft a body. Look closely at certain pillars, and you can see arms carved along the sides. Yes, hands rendered in bas-relief near the base. These aren't just geometric forms. They may be depictions of beings, anthropomorphic, intentional, meaningful. But what beings? Here's where it gets strange in a way that mainstream archaeology has been slow to reckon with. The carvings on these pillars include creatures that are clearly identifiable. Aurochs, wild boar, gazelle, crane, vulture, scorpion. These are real animals of the region rendered with impressive accuracy. But scattered among them are other figures, creatures with features that don't map cleanly onto any known Anatolian wildlife. Some researchers have pointed to what appear to be predatory felines depicted in poses and proportions that are unusual. Others have noted what look like hybrid figures, part human, part animal, that appear in the carved reliefs and suggest a symbolic universe far more complex than anything we'd expect from a society supposedly at the hunter-gatherer stage. Is it possible that the builders of Göbekli Tepe had a cosmological system, a fully developed mythology, a structured understanding of the relationship between humans, animals, and the cosmos, that predates by thousands of years the mythological traditions we think of as humanity's oldest? What if our entire timeline of symbolic thought, of religious consciousness, of organized spiritual life needs to be pushed back by millennia? Here's where the standard timeline of human history doesn't just bend, it breaks. According to the model that dominated archaeology through most of the 20th century, a model largely derived from the work of scholars like Vere Gordon-Childe, civilization follows a predictable sequence. First, humans develop agriculture. The availability of reliable food surpluses creates the conditions for permanent settlement. Settled communities accumulate wealth and develop social hierarchies. Social complexity eventually produces the conditions for religion, monumental architecture, and organized labor. In this model, big temples and stone monuments are symptoms of a society that has already gone through the agricultural revolution. You grow food first, then you build. Göbekli Tepe, which predates the earliest evidence of agriculture by at least 1,000 years in this region, does not follow this script at all. Schmidt himself, after years of excavation and analysis, proposed something radical, that the causation might run in exactly the opposite direction. What if people didn't build temples because they had agriculture? What if they developed agriculture because they needed to feed the workers who were building the temple? What if religion, or something that functioned like religion, came first? What if the impulse to create sacred space, to gather, to perform ritual, to mark the cosmos in stone, is older and more fundamental to human nature than we ever imagined? This is not a fringe position. Schmidt published this hypothesis in peer-reviewed journals, and it has been debated seriously within academic archaeology. But consider the implications. If Schmidt is right, then the entire edifice of how we explain the rise of civilization needs to be reconstructed. Every textbook about the Neolithic revolution becomes at best incomplete, at worst backwards. Some researchers go much further. They argue that Göbekli Tepe is not an isolated anomaly, that it is a marker, a clue, pointing toward an entire chapter of human history that has been erased or overlooked. A chapter of sophisticated, organized, symbolically rich human culture stretching back into the late Ice Age itself. And then there are those who say something that mainstream archaeology will not officially entertain, that Göbekli Tepe may not be the origin of this culture. It may be one of the last remnants of it. Imagine standing inside one of those enclosures at dawn, 11,000 years ago. The stone pillars rise around you, taller than two of your tallest kinsmen standing on each other's shoulders. The carvings catch the first light, the vulture with its wings extended, the scorpion coiled at the base of a pillar, the predator frozen mid-leap in shallow relief. There are people here, many people, more people than should be possible to feed in this region without agriculture, which means they've traveled, gathered, organized. There is sound, drumming perhaps, or chanting, something rhythmic and intentional. There is purpose. This is not a casual gathering. This is a civilization at work. Whatever their words for it, whatever system of meaning they carry in their minds, it is intricate, it is structured, and it is pointing at something vast, the sky perhaps, or the turning of ages, or the deep grammar of the cosmos itself. What did they know that we don't? What did they see from this specific hilltop, at this specific time of year, at this specific angle to the stars, that made this place worth moving 10-ton stones for? Because that's the other question that won't leave you alone once you start pulling on this thread. How? How did hunter-gatherers, people without metal tools, without wheeled vehicles, without draft animals in the commonly accepted timeline, quarry, transport, and erect limestone pillars weighing up to 10 metric tons? Unfinished pillars have been found in the nearby quarry, still partially attached to the bedrock, giving us a rare glimpse at the process. But the process itself remains, in essential ways, unexplained. Some researchers have proposed systems of wooden sledges, rope, and an organized human labor. Others have noted that even with those methods, the organizational complexity required would demand a level of social coordination we don't associate with pre-agricultural societies. Could it be that the societies we call pre-agricultural were far more complex, far more organized, far more capable than our models have assumed? Klaus Schmidt died in 2014. He was 60 years old, not finished, not done with the questions that Göbekli Tepe had opened in him. He collapsed while swimming near Weißendorf in Germany and never regained consciousness. He had spent 18 years excavating perhaps 5% of the site. 95% of Göbekli Tepe remains unexcavated as of today. Schmidt himself estimated that a thorough excavation of the entire site could take another 50 years. He once described the place not as a temple, the word archaeologists reflexively reach for, but as a cathedral on a hill, a place of profound and organized religious significance, built by people who were, in his words, not primitive at all. Here's what makes Schmidt's death feel, to some observers, like more than simple tragedy. In the years before he died, he had begun hinting in interviews and conversations at conclusions he wasn't quite ready to commit to in print. He spoke of the site's astronomical alignments, the possibility that the enclosures were oriented toward specific star positions, possibly Orion, possibly the Pleiades, possibly in ways that encoded a form of astronomical knowledge of startling sophistication. He mentioned in one conversation reported by colleagues the idea that the site might mark not the beginning of something but the end, the terminal monument of a culture in decline, built as a kind of final statement before a catastrophe erased whatever had come before. What catastrophe? What came before? And why? This is the question that certain researchers now ask openly. Why did the academic establishment move so slowly to engage with the full implications of what Schmidt found? Why did it take decades after the initial excavation for Göbekli Tepe to enter mainstream public consciousness? Is it possible that the implications were simply too disruptive? That there are careers, institutions, entire theoretical frameworks built on the standard timeline, frameworks that Göbekli Tepe, properly understood, might demolish? Let's talk about the Younger Dryas. This is not a speculative theory. It is a well-documented geologic event. Approximately 12,900 years ago, Earth experienced a rapid and severe climate shift that plunged much of the northern hemisphere back into near glacial conditions for roughly 1,200 years before temperatures abruptly rebounded. The Younger Dryas is real. Its effects on human populations in the Near East were profound. It would have disrupted food supplies, forced mass migrations, altered the landscape of an entire region. And it falls almost precisely within the period when Göbekli Tepe was being built. Some researchers on Rewrote, and this is where the conversation gets genuinely electric, have proposed that the Younger Dryas was triggered not by gradual climate patterns, but by a cosmic impact event. The Younger Dryas impact hypothesis, as it is known, suggests that one or more fragments of a comet or asteroid struck or exploded above the Earth approximately 12,900 years ago, triggering fires, floods, massive temperature shifts, and, crucially, the rapid end of the Pleistocene megafauna. The mammoths, the giant ground sloths, the enormous predators that had coexisted with humans for hundreds of thousands of years disappeared in what, geologically speaking, was an eye blink. This hypothesis is controversial. It is debated. Not all researchers accept it. But studies published in scientific journals have identified impact-related materials, nanodiamonds, iridium, platinum, at Younger Dryas boundary layers at sites across multiple continents. Now here's the question that connects this to Göbekli Tepe in a way that should make you stop and sit with the implications for a moment. What if Göbekli Tepe was built in the aftermath of exactly such an event? What if the people who built it were the survivors of a civilizational catastrophe? People who had lost most of their population, most of their knowledge, most of their infrastructure, gathering on a hilltop to record what they remembered, to encode in stone the astronomical and symbolic knowledge of a culture that was rapidly disappearing. What if those pillars are not the beginning of civilization, but a memorial to it? Yet there is a researcher named Graham Hancock who has spent decades arguing for precisely this kind of scenario, a lost civilization, or at least a lost chapter of sophisticated human culture, existing during the late Pleistocene and destroyed by the cataclysm of the Younger Dryas. Hancock is not an archaeologist. He does not hold an academic position. Mainstream archaeology has, for the most part, treated him the way institutions tend to treat outsiders who challenge foundational assumptions, with a combination of dismissal and irritation. But here's what's interesting. Some of Hancock's specific claims about Göbekli Tepe's astronomical alignments have been taken seriously enough to generate actual academic research. A study published in the Mediterranean Archaeology and Archaeometry Journal proposed that the layout of Göbekli Tepe's enclosure D was oriented to mark a cataclysmic event in the sky around 10,900 BC, a date that falls within the Younger Dryas period. Could it be that the carvings on the pillars, particularly the so-called vulture stone, are not decorative but astronomical? A star map recording the position of the sky at a specific catastrophic moment? Some researchers say yes. Others say the alignments, while intriguing, are not conclusive. But here's the deeper question beneath the academic argument. Why are we so resistant to the idea that our ancestors were watching the sky, building systems of knowledge, encoding that knowledge in stone, long before we gave them permission to do so? But what does it mean that our model of human development has no room for Göbekli Tepe to exist, and yet Göbekli Tepe exists? What if our discomfort with this site is itself a kind of evidence? Evidence that the story we've been telling about ourselves is incomplete? Let's pull back for a moment and consider the geography. Göbekli Tepe sits at the northern edge of the Fertile Crescent, the region that mainstream archaeology identifies as the cradle of agriculture and, by extension, of civilization. The earliest evidence of wheat cultivation appears within 100 kilometers of this hilltop. The earliest evidence of pig domestication within a similar radius. The earliest evidence of cattle domestication close enough to be connected. It is almost as if the agricultural revolution, if the single most transformative development in human history, radiated outward from this precise location, from this hill. And at the center of that radiation is a monument of stone that predates the agriculture itself. Some researchers have drawn a map, literally a cartographic visualization, of the relationship between Göbekli Tepe's position and the origin points of the world's foundational crops. Emmer wheat, einkorn wheat, barley. The wild ancestors of these plants are native to the hills surrounding the site. Is it possible that the gathering of people at Göbekli Tepe, the labor force required to build and maintain this site, the organizational complexity it demanded, created the conditions for the accidental or intentional domestication of wild grain? Of his life trying to quantify the relationship. But here's where the mystery pulls in another direction entirely. If Göbekli Tepe is approximately 11,600 years old in its oldest layers, and if the site was in continuous use for approximately 2,000 years before being deliberately buried, then we are talking about an institution, a sacred site, a place of organized religious or social activity that lasted longer than the entire period from the first pyramid to the present day. 2,000 years of continuous ritual activity on this one hill. What was being maintained? What knowledge was being transmitted? And what was so significant about the moment of burial, somewhere around 9,000 years ago, that it required sealing the entire complex forever? Here's where it gets strange in a way that is very difficult to explain with conventional models. Geophysical surveys conducted in the years since Schmidt began excavating have revealed that the buried portions of the site are significantly larger than the excavated areas. The survey suggests the presence of potentially dozens of additional enclosures, additional pillar complexes, spread across an area that could encompass the entire hilltop and beyond. We have seen in nearly 3 decades of excavation perhaps 5% of what exists there. 95% of whatever is encoded in that hill, whatever messages in stone the builders left, remains unread, yet untouched, waiting. Now consider what 5% has already done to our understanding of human history. Consider that the 5% we've excavated has forced a complete revision of the timeline of human symbolic thought, human organizational capacity, and human architectural achievement. What is in the other 95%? What if there are enclosures oriented to other astronomical events? Equinoxes, solstices, star risings, cosmic cycles that would allow researchers to reconstruct not just the site's function, but the entire cosmological system of its builders. What if there are inscriptions, proto-writing, symbolic systems that would give us direct access to the thoughts of people who existed thousands of years before what we consider the dawn of writing? What if the very center of the site, the oldest, yet deepest layers, the ones we haven't touched, contain something that would force the kind of revision that makes academic institutions wake up in the night? Is it possible that the excavation of Göbekli Tepe is being conducted with a certain strategic caution precisely because those involved understand what finding certain things might do to the established order of human history? Consider the Turkish government's relationship to the site. Göbekli Tepe was designated a UNESCO World Heritage Site in 2018. The Turkish state has invested significantly in tourism infrastructure around the site, but there have also been, over the years, tensions around excavation access, around the involvement of foreign archaeologists, around questions of who controls what gets excavated, when and in what order. Schmidt himself had, according to colleagues, a complex and sometimes difficult relationship with the bureaucratic realities of working at such a politically significant site. Some researchers have suggested that the pace of excavation, extraordinarily slow by the standards of what is clearly one of the most important archaeological discoveries in human history, reflects not just the technical challenges of careful excavation, but also institutional choices about how quickly the implications of this site should be allowed to land on the public consciousness. Is that a conspiracy? No, it doesn't need to be a conspiracy. Institutions, academic and governmental alike, have their own rhythms, their own interests, their own comfort zones. The archaeological establishment has spent a century building a model of human prehistory. Yet that model has funding structures, career trajectories, museum installations, university curricula, all built around it. Göbekli Tepe does not fit that model, and the parts of Göbekli Tepe that might be most destabilizing to the model are still in the ground. Think about that carefully. The most dangerous evidence, the evidence that might require the most radical revision, has not yet been brought to light. Perhaps it won't be in our lifetimes. Perhaps that is by design. Or perhaps, and this is a more charitable reading, the people responsible for this site are simply being appropriately careful with something irreplaceable. Both possibilities are true simultaneously. Both are worth holding in mind. Let's talk about what Göbekli Tepe means in the context of other ancient mysteries, because this is a thread that, once pulled, does not stop. There are other sites around the world that share certain characteristics with Göbekli Tepe, certain structural anomalies, certain questions of chronology, certain architectural achievements that sit uncomfortably within the standard timeline of human development. Göbekli Tepe is the most dramatic example, but it is not alone. Çatalhöyük in Turkey, though younger, displays a symbolic complexity that continues to confound easy explanation. The underwater structures off the coast of India near Dwarka, some of which have been dated to periods that challenge conventional chronology. The megalithic temples of Malta, which predate the Egyptian pyramids and display astronomical alignments that required sophisticated observation over long periods of time. The sites of Caral in Peru and Tiahuanaco in Bolivia, which each present their own versions of the same basic puzzle, sophisticated, organized, symbolically rich cultures appearing earlier than our models predict. What if these sites are not coincidental anomalies scattered across space and time by chance? What if they are connected, not necessarily by direct cultural contact, though some researchers make that argument, but by being remnants of a broader, older, more sophisticated human past that the standard timeline has no room for? Some researchers use the phrase high-level civilization carefully, aware of the baggage it carries and the speculative leaps it invites. Others, less cautious, use the word civilization plainly. A lost civilization, one that existed during the late Pleistocene, was devastated by the Younger Dryas cataclysm, and left these scattered monuments as its only surviving legacy. Göbekli Tepe on this reading is not the dawn, it is the dusk. What did Klaus Schmidt believe in the end? His published work is careful, calibrated, academic. But colleagues who worked with him and friends who knew him describe a man who, in private conversation, was willing to go further than his published conclusions. A man who believed that Göbekli Tepe represented evidence of human cognitive and social development far more ancient and far more sophisticated than the standard timeline permitted. A man who was, in the last years of his life, increasingly interested in the astronomical dimensions of the site, in the possibility that the pillars encode specific star positions, specific moments in the precession of the equinoxes, as if someone was trying to leave a message for people who would come thousands of years later and know how to read the sky. Consider the precession of the equinoxes. This is the approximately 26,000-year cycle during which the Earth's axial wobble causes the position of the equinoxes to slowly migrate through the constellations of the zodiac. It is a vast, slow, cosmic clock. A full cycle takes 25,720 years to complete. To even observe the precession, to notice that the stars are slowly shifting, requires sustained, careful observation over centuries, generations of sky watchers, institutional memory, record keeping. In other words, it requires exactly the kind of organized, cumulative knowledge that we don't associate with pre-agricultural hunter-gatherers. And yet some researchers, not cranks, not fringe figures, but scholars publishing in legitimate journals, have argued that the layout and astronomical alignments of Göbekli Tepe reflect awareness of precessional cycles, that the builders knew about the 26,000-year clock, that they were marking it in stone. If that's true, if the builders of Göbekli Tepe understood precession, then we are dealing with a civilization of astronomers, a civilization with institutional memory stretching back centuries, a civilization that, by any reasonable definition of the word, should not exist at 11,600 BC. Let's slow down here and sit in the strangeness of this for a moment, because it's easy to move too fast past the implications and lose them in the momentum of the narrative. And 11,600 years ago, 12,000 years, let that settle into you as a temporal reality. The Egyptian pyramids at Giza were built approximately 4,500 years ago. The Roman Empire, at its height, a structure of extraordinary administrative, military, and architectural complexity, reached its peak approximately 2,000 years ago. From Rome to us is 2,000 years. From Rome to the pyramids is another 2,500 years. Now double that, triple it, keep going. 11,600 years ago puts you in a world so remote, so stripped of the reference points we use to imagine the past, that it begins to feel less like history and more like myth. And yet the stones are there, the carvings are there, the enclosures are there, the precision is there. That whatever we believe or don't believe about what kind of society built them, the physical reality of Göbekli Tepe does not yield to skepticism. It is stubborn, solid, 11,000-year-old limestone, and it insists that something happened here that our story of human development cannot fully account for. What if the story of human development that we've built is not wrong exactly, but simply incomplete? What if we have found the pieces of a puzzle and arranged them into a picture that is locally coherent but globally mistaken? A picture that fits the evidence we've excavated but leaves out the evidence we haven't found yet or haven't been willing to find. That is perhaps the most unsettling possibility of all. Not that we're being lied to, not that there's a conspiracy, but that we simply don't know. That the most honest and accurate thing a scientist can say about human prehistory in the wake of Göbekli Tepe is, we don't know, we thought we did. We built textbooks on it, we built careers on it. And then a man named Klaus Schmidt stood on a hillside in Turkey and found something that made the textbooks tremble. Pstabashiksh. There's another dimension to this story that rarely gets the attention it deserves. The question of what Göbekli Tepe was for. Was it a temple? That's the word that gets used most often, and it fits in the sense that the site appears to be a place of gathering, of ritual, of symbolic activity. But temple is also a word that carries enormous cultural baggage, freighted with the specific religious architectures of Western and Near Eastern tradition. The builders of Göbekli Tepe didn't have a concept of temple in any sense we'd recognize. What they had was, apparently, a place of enormous importance, a place worth the most extraordinary labor, worth the gathering of hundreds or thousands of people, worth the movement of 10 metric ton stones. But the nature of that importance remains genuinely mysterious. Some researchers believe the site was connected to death rituals, to practices around the processing and honoring of the dead. The vulture imagery appears repeatedly on the pillars, and vultures in many ancient cultures were associated with death and transformation. Human bones have been found at the site, some showing evidence of deliberate processing, which could indicate funerary practices of extraordinary sophistication. Is it possible that Göbekli Tepe is, at its core, a monument to the dead? A place where communities gathered from across a vast region to perform ceremonies for their ancestors, to mark the boundary between the living and the dead, to maintain connections across time? What if the entire site, the circular enclosures, the central pillars, the carvings, the astronomical alignments, is one enormous, elaborately structured conversation with mortality? There are those who take this further, who suggest that the beings carved on the pillars, the anthropomorphic figures, the entities that are not quite human and not quite animal, are not naturalistic depictions at all, but representations of the dead, or of the spirits of the dead, or of something even more difficult to categorize within our current conceptual vocabulary. What if the builders of Göbekli Tepe had a cosmology, a fully worked out understanding of the cosmos, the human soul, the nature of consciousness and its survival? That predates every philosophical and religious tradition we recognize. What if everything we think of as the oldest human wisdom, the Vedas, the oldest Egyptian texts, the Sumerian creation myths, is itself a later partial degraded memory of something that was already ancient when those traditions began? It is worth pausing here to acknowledge that not everyone agrees with the most dramatic interpretations of Göbekli Tepe. Mainstream archaeology accepts the basic facts, the age, the scale, the complexity, and treats them as evidence that human cognitive capacity and social organization were more sophisticated earlier than previously believed. This is significant. This alone required a revision of the textbooks. But mainstream archaeology resists the leap to lost civilizations, resisted astronomical alignment theories for years, and continues to insist that the site should be understood within the context of known late Paleolithic and early Neolithic cultures, rather than as evidence of something entirely outside our current models. That position is defensible. It is cautious. It is scientific in the sense that it doesn't speculate beyond what the evidence directly supports. But here's the problem with extreme caution in the face of Göbekli Tepe. The site itself was not cautious. It is not subtle. It is not a minor anomaly to be smoothed over with careful language about revising our estimates and expanding our understanding. It is a declaration, 11,000 years old, carved in stone, impossible to explain away, that something happened here that we do not understand. And the more carefully you look at the architecture, the carvings, the layout, the deliberate burial, the scale of the organized labor required, the astronomical orientations, the connections to the origin of agriculture, the connection to the timing of the Younger Dryas, the more it seems like less of a footnote and more of a central chapter of a story we haven't learned to read yet. Is it possible that the next major archaeological discovery, the one that might finally reveal what came before Göbekli Tepe, what culture produced its builders, what knowledge they were encoding, is already sitting in the ground somewhere, yet waiting for the right person to notice it the way Schmidt noticed the limestone shapes on that Turkish hillside in 1994? Is it possible that discovery is already out there, already identified, already filed away and underfunded and misclassified, the way Göbekli Tepe was filed away for 30 years after Peter Benedict walked past it in 1963? The excavations at Göbekli Tepe continue. After Schmidt's death, the work passed to other German and Turkish archaeologists. New enclosures are being uncovered, new carvings are being studied. In recent years, researchers found what appears to be a ritual feasting area, storage for large quantities of food, suggesting that the site hosted communal gatherings of significant scale. The picture that emerges is of a pilgrimage site, which is perhaps a place to which people traveled from great distances at specific times for specific purposes, a sacred center around which the social world of a vast region organized itself. Recent geophysical surveys have also suggested the presence of large stone structures below the layers currently being excavated, structures that might predate even the oldest pillars so far uncovered, structures from even deeper in time. What if Göbekli Tepe has not one origin but many, layer upon layer of construction, each generation adding to what came before, each layer pushing the beginning of this story further back than we've yet allowed ourselves to imagine? What if the oldest layer, the one we haven't reached, the one that might be 13 or 14 or 15,000 years old, contains the key to understanding what this place really is and who really built it? Klaus Schmidt once said in one of his rare poetic moments that Göbekli Tepe was a site that will take generations to understand. He meant it as an observation about the pace of excavation, about the complexity of the evidence. But some of those who knew him believe he meant something more, that he had glimpsed in those 18 years on the hilltop something vast and strange and not yet nameable, something that he didn't have the conceptual tools to fully articulate, and that the discipline of archaeology, as it currently exists, might not yet have the framework to contain. What did Klaus Schmidt know at the end? What was he reaching toward? Such in those last conversations with colleagues about astronomical alignments and cyclical catastrophes, and a culture that might have built these stones as a message to a future it somehow knew was coming? We can't know. He died before the excavation was complete. He died before the geophysical surveys revealed the full scale of what remains buried. He died before the most important questions his discovery raised had been publicly asked, let alone answered. But the hill remains. The pillars remain. The carvings, the vultures and scorpions, the predators, and the strange beings that might be human or might be something else, remain exactly as they were placed, with intention and care and knowledge we don't yet possess, 11,000 years ago. They were there before the pyramids, before Mesopotamia, before the Indus Valley, before any civilization whose name we recognize. They will be there after the current excavation ends and the next one begins. After the researchers who are working there now have written their papers and retired and passed away. After the textbooks are revised again and again, each revision a little more honest about how much we don't know. And somewhere, deep in the 95% of the site that remains untouched, something waits. Evidence, perhaps, that would finally answer the question that Göbekli Tepe has been asking since Klaus Schmidt first knelt in the Turkish dust and realized what he had found. The question is simple, even if the answer is not. Who were we before we thought we knew who we were? What did we build before we thought we knew how to build? What did we believe before we thought we knew when belief began? So where does this leave us? What do we make of Klaus Schmidt and the hill he dedicated 18 years of his life to, and the mystery he died without resolving? 3 possibilities present themselves, and none of them is comfortable. The first possibility is the most conservative. Göbekli Tepe represents a sophisticated but ultimately explicable development in late Paleolithic human culture. Hunter-gatherers were cognitively capable of symbolic thought, social organization, and monumental architecture. We simply underestimated them. The site is extraordinary, but it doesn't require us to posit lost civilizations or cosmic catastrophes. It just requires us to revise our timeline. This reading is defensible. It is supported by the majority of archaeologists working on the site. It is the least disruptive to our current understanding, and it might be completely wrong. The second possibility is that Göbekli Tepe is what some researchers, working at the edges of mainstream archaeology, have begun to call it the terminal monument of a lost civilization. A culture or cultures existing during the late Pleistocene, before the Younger Dryas cataclysm, that achieved levels of organizational, astronomical, and symbolic sophistication that have no place in our current models. A civilization that was devastated or destroyed, that survived in scattered remnants, and that built Göbekli Tepe, and perhaps other sites we haven't yet found or properly understood, as a record of what had been lost. This reading requires a leap. But it requires a smaller leap with each passing year of excavation than it did before. And the third possibility is the one that none of the frameworks, conservative or speculative, can quite contain. The possibility that the builders of Göbekli Tepe knew something about the nature of time, about cyclical catastrophe, about the relationship between human consciousness and the cosmos that is genuinely beyond our current ability to conceptualize. That the message encoded in those stones is not just historical or astronomical, but philosophical, a statement about the human condition, about what we lose and what we rebuild, about the strange resilience of the impulse to make meaning in stone that resonates across 11,000 years and lands undiminished in the present moment. Maybe it's all 3. Maybe the truth is layered the way the site itself is layered, different things to different eyes, at different revelations at different depths. Klaus Schmidt stood on that hill in 1996 and knew he had found something that would outlast him, something that would outlast all of us who are alive now to argue about its meaning. He returned year after year, excavating 5% of a mystery and knowing that 5% was enough to shake the world. He died with the other 95% still in the ground. The stones are patient. They have been waiting for 11,000 years. They can wait a little longer. What do you think really happened on that hill? And what do you think still waits to be found beneath it? Share your thoughts in the comments. The mystery is real, the questions are genuine, and the answers, if they come, it will come from people willing to sit with not knowing long enough to eventually know. Keep your minds open, and until we meet again, stay curious.